right, folks, we are back with another installment of the Muscle and Strength Training Pyramid. So, quick recap of the pyramid. We've got least important to most important, the base of the pyramid being the most important, adherence at the bottom, volume, intensity, and frequency after that, which we just discussed last week, progression after that, exercise selection, rest periods, and finally tempo. All of this is encompassed within the thought process of periodization, which is managing all these variables to get an outcome over time. And today we're going to be talking about progression. Okay? So before we jump right into progression, I want to address some of the questions that I've had and some of the conversations and discussions and clarifications that I've had with people online since last week's episode of volume, intensity, and frequency. And I think where people got a little hung up was thinking about the recommendations I made for volume, intensity, and frequency in very black and white terms and without applying critical thinking to them, and with forgetting about the concept of individual variability. So, we're going to talk about some of those things. For everyone, these are principles, not rules. Okay? The difference between a principle versus a rule is that this is not the 10 Commandments, thou must not kill, thou must have 40 to 70 reps per session. However, these are principles. Okay? These are principles based on the evidence we have, which is based on a certain limited application of that. So I've made some videos on proper application of science to bodybuilding. It means you have to remember that when we're looking at the Wernbaum systematic analysis, for example, that this is a bunch of studies and then creating a population norm. And when you think about it, 40 to 70 reps per body part is actually a pretty damn broad range. And then doing that 2 to 3 times per week is actually an even broader range of how many reps per body part per week you get. Okay, so first off, these are principles versus rules. There's not a right or wrong way to train. I am trying to give you guys some information, and gals, to get you in the ballpark of what might be a good place to start that is closer to optimal than further away, so that therefore you can individually adjust. All right? Also, critical thinking versus black and white. Don't just take my word for it because I'm Eric Helms, okay? I want you guys to look at the articles. If you can, read through the scientific texts or even just the abstracts, or at least understand the principles, that would be very important. But more so, I want you to apply your own critical thinking skills to some of this information versus thinking black or white. 39 reps means I don't grow at all. 71 reps means I don't grow at all, but in the middle, I grow. No, that's not the way it works. I got a lot of comments, people asking me, hey, what about X or what about Y? For example, one person was saying, hey, what about John Bros or Zerdos or the Bulgarian weightlifters? They go to high intensity all the time and do much more volume than this. But they're growing and they're making progress. And you have to remember that, as I discussed in volume, intensity, and frequency, you can make a good high volume, high intensity, or high frequency program if you adjust the others, right? So, that also means that you can have an optimal approach that might fall outside of these general guidelines. All right? Optimal for you, maybe if you adapt to it. But more importantly than all that is that it's not either an on or off switch. It's not black or white. It's not I make progress or I don't. It's maybe I make better progress. If we go back to that study that I mentioned last week, where we had the 3 groups, and over 10 weeks they matched their volume, but one group did roughly 90 of their reps over that 10-week period at 90% of 1RM or plus. One group did about 45, and the other group did about 180. The 90 group actually made the best strength gains, right? I'm not saying that these guys didn't make strength gains. In fact, all 3 groups made pretty reasonable progress. The progress was just higher here. So it's not about right or wrong. It's about getting closer to making the most efficient progress, okay? And who's to say that after 10 weeks, maybe that higher or lower intensity group started to do better as they adapted to the program. Now, so, clearing that up, okay? I also want to restate something about individual variability. And to be clear to you that while that 40 to 70 reps per body part 3 times a week was what stood out as the most effective range to encompass the maximal growth response per unit of time in the Wernbaum systematic review, that means that you have to remember that this is an average. And you have, the bell curve, and then you have people out here than people out here. You're going to have people who aren't represented by the average. You may have someone who did better at 3 days a week at 70 reps per body part, and you may have someone who did better at 2 days per week at 40 reps per body part, and they would have done worse at the other one. But the mean, when you collate all those people together, means that they all fall somewhere within that range. So it doesn't mean that 2 days per week of training each body part with 40 reps is the same as 3 days per week for each body part training it with 70 reps. Think about this objectively and with critical thinking. That's 80 reps per week per body part versus 210 reps per week per body part. Of course those aren't the same. In fact, that's almost 3 times as much volume on a week-to-week basis as that. Okay? So, having said all that, I now want you to think again about how you might set up a program based on these broad recommendations, and also considering overlap and the goals of either strength or hypertrophy. So, doing that, I'm going to scoot you guys over. Scoot, 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 scoot. And we're going to talk about some sample programming. All right? So, we have a quick recap of the recommendations I made last week, once this decides to stop moving. For volume, 40 to 70 reps per muscle group per session. Okay? For intensity, if your goal is strength, getting 3/4 of that volume in the 1 to 6 repetition max intensity range, and the other fourth higher than 6 RM, so 7 RM plus, maybe up to 12. And then if your goal is hypertrophy, 3/4 in the 6 to 12 RM range, and then the other fourth above and below that, say anywhere from 3 to 15 RM is probably a good load for if your goal is strictly hypertrophy. All right? And then the frequency being training each muscle group 2 to 3 times per week. Okay? So that could be organized as 2 full body sessions, 3 full body sessions, legs push pull off, upper lower off, upper lower off off. There's many, many ways to do this. Or upper lower off. Those are all fall within the guidelines of what I said. And then you simply spread out your volume across them. Okay? So here's a very simple and not optimal, not what I'm recommending, just an example, a sample program of how you might follow these guidelines for strength. On Monday, we've got a 5x5 with bench, 3x6 with overhead press, and then 3x8 to 12 with row. Okay? Overlap. Remember that if your goal is strength, you don't necessarily care about making sure that you develop the outer head of your tricep. Your goal is to get stronger, and you will have to acknowledge that a bench press trains your delts, trains your triceps, and trains your chest. An overhead press trains your delts, trains your triceps, and you can make an argument for a little bit of upper pec, but we won't get too pedantic. All right? And then a row is going to train biceps, pretty much the entire back, including lats, including your erector spinae if you're holding a static row, all that stuff, depending on how you do it. But we'll just say lats, rhomboids, and traps with a row. Okay. Then on Tuesday we have, and I said 3x8 to 12. I don't know if I did. So row 3x8 to 12. Tuesday we have squat or deadlift. Each week you alternate, and you do 5x5. And then if you were doing squats, you do RDLs, and if you were doing deads, you do front squats. So it's literally just 2 movements this day. Either it's a squat RDL day or a deadlift front squat day. You do 5x5 on the squat or deadlift, and then 3x6 on the RDL or front squat. For someone concerned with strength, that pretty much trains the whole lower body. Glutes, hams, quads, and yes, even your calves a little bit from those squats, front squat or back squat. But who really cares about calves if your purely goal is strength, right? Okay? Thursday we're coming back to the upper body, and we've got bench, 5 sets of 3, flat dumbbell press, 4 sets of 6, and then chin-ups, or lat pull down if you want, if you're too fat to do them. 3x8 to 12, okay? Again, bench and flat dumbbell press is delts, chest, and triceps. Chins is back and biceps, all right? And I want to point out that the weeks you do deadlift, that's also back, right? Friday, we have dead and squats, 5x12, and then front squat and RDL. So it's the same workout except flipped. So if you did squat RDL on Tuesday, you would do deadlift front squat on Friday. All right? 5 sets of 3, then 4 sets of 6. Now, here's the thing. You will notice that these are pretty close to the targets we want. If we look at, let's just take a look at back, all right? On Monday, we have 3 by 8 to 12. You're going, hold on, that's only 30 reps. We're 10 reps short of our target. Wait. Then we have RDL, deads, and front squats as potential movements that we do on Tuesday. Anyone who's done front squats, you know that it takes an extreme amount of effort to keep that front rack position. RDL, maintaining scapular retraction, also takes a lot of back. And the deadlift is going to be an intense, well, and of course the RDL, lots of lumbar. So the deadlift, also a lot of spinal erector. You do have to go through spinal extension and shoulder extension a little bit to lock it out and through the range of motion. So you can count a little bit of that volume towards back, okay? That's also true on Friday. So you're getting some back work semi-indirectly, semi-directly from front squat, RDLs, and deads on Tuesday and Friday. So that's why the chins and the rows are only 3 by 8 to 12 instead of, say, 4 by 8 to 12 to reach that 40 rep mark. Because if you think about the 30 and the 30, and then the incidental reps from deadlift and RDL and front squats, that's roughly 2 times a week at 40 reps per body part for back, okay? Critical thinking, all right? Delts, chest, triceps, we can pretty much see how this covers it. We've got 25 and 18 reps right here. That's 43, and that's going to cover triceps, delts, and chest. And you're getting maybe a little short on chest if you decide not to count any of those reps of the overhead press for the clavicular head of the pack. All right. However, let's say we only get 25 on Monday. On Thursday, we do 3 by 5 with bench, and then flat dumbbells 4 by 6. So now we're at 39 reps. So we're getting pretty close the second day. All right. And then we've got plenty of leg volume. We've got 25 plus 18 for the legs, 43. And then we've got 15 plus 24, 39. Now, I said 40 to 70. Don't get too caught up on that exact range because Wernbaum actually has 2 different ranges for upper body and lower body, and they're both in the mid-30s and the mid-60s. So to cover them both, I just shifted it forward a little bit. So if you're in the high 30s, mid-30s, not a big deal, okay? So that's an example of a strength workout where you're skirting the very lower end of the recommendations. And even on the days for back where you're a little bit short, you can look at those other days where you're getting some incidental back work. Remember, it doesn't mean that if you step in the gym, you have to do 40 reps. If you're in the gym 3 times and you get, say, 30 reps each time, that's 90 reps per week. That's actually more than if you've done 2 and 40 each time, right? So 90 is greater than 40, even though one is 30 reps 3 times a week and the other one is 40 reps twice a week. So long as you're in the range of 80 to 210 reps per body part per week, over 2 to 3 sessions, that's pretty much what I've recommended, okay? Now, this is a minimalist approach, just trying to make a point. Over here, we have a hypertrophy routine. This is based on an upper-lower setup, upper-lower, also Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, very similar to here, but now we do care about every little muscle group, and we're not going to leave any overlap to chance, okay? We're going to go, you know what, maybe my back takes over more than my biceps on the back work, maybe my chest and delts take over more than my triceps on my pressing. So I'm going to make sure that I get all of those little pieces, and I'm not going to be happy with just getting 40. I want to make sure that I'm in the middle of the range and not in the high 30s or anything like that. So Monday, we've got bench, 4 by 4 to 6, row, 3 by 6 to 8, and then incline dumbbell, chins, a tricep exercise, a bicep exercise, and lateral raise, all for 3 by 8 to 12. All right? Tuesday, squat alternating with deadlift, the same way as we did it over here, 4 by 4 to 6, leg extension to leg curl, both at 3 by 8 to 12, and then standing calf raise, 4 by 6 to 8. Thursday, flat dumbbell press, lat pull down, overhead press, and row, all 3 by 8 to 12, and then chest flies, triceps, biceps, 2 by 12 to 15. And then on Friday we have leg press, RDL, both 3 by 8 to 12. And then we have leg extension, leg curl, 3 by 12 to 15. And we finish off with seated calf raises, 4 by 8 to 12. Now if you look at this, you'll notice the vast majority of the reps do fall between the 6 to 12 range. Maybe not rep max, but in there. And a small amount are above and below that. Just like over here, the vast majority of it was 6 and lower, and we've got some accessory work in the 8 to 12. The total amount of volume, roughly 3/4 from our 1 to 6, roughly 1/4 higher, roughly 3/4 in the middle of the range, roughly 1/4 spread between our little bit of strength work there and our little bit of high rep work in the 12 to 15 range here and there. Once again, you'll notice some places fall slightly shy, like our calves. We're doing about 30 reps on both days. However, squats and front squats and leg press do get a little bit of plantar flexion in them, so we can round up a little bit. Of course, if you had weak calves, you could do more. You could train them on an upper day if you wanted. There's a lot of ways to apply this, but these definitely, I would say, fall within the recommendations. Now, they don't if you aren't able to use critical thinking or if you think extremely black and white about this, but that's not the way to think. All right? So that's a bit of a recap on how to apply volume, intensity, and frequency. Now, let's get on to progression. All right, so now we're getting on to progression. We've finished clarifying volume, intensity, and frequency. Now let's talk about progression. Now, when I say progression, I want to emphasize that I already said progressive overload is almost a given. And if you organize your volume and intensity and frequency properly, you will see progress. But at a certain point, you need to ensure that it occurs. So progressive resistance training is very important. Whether your goal is to get bigger or whether it is to get stronger, you need to make sure that there is a progressive increase in the stimulus over time. Remember that that means this over your entire career, but workout to workout, the changes are much smaller. Okay, and it almost looks flat depending on your training age. So, training age. There's a great discussion of this in Practical Programming by Ripito. And basically what they do is they match the progression time course to the training age of the person, how long you've been lifting and how close you are to your genetic ceiling. So for example, a beginner would microload each workout. So if you did squats 3 times per week, that means every single time you squatted, you would increase a very small load on the bar. You might have a different rep target on each day, but each week it would be slightly higher. Okay? When I say microload, I mean the smallest load increment you can make. That might be, if you have small plates, 1.25 kg per side, so 2.5 kg, or just 5 pounds per workout, or even smaller if you can get down there, if you have, say, 1.25 pound plates or 0.5 kg plates. Okay? But those aren't available in all gyms. If you can't microload and you're a rank beginner, you can do the same thing and just do it every other week. And just make sure that second week you've improved the feeling of the performance. It felt easier. Okay? So, in Ripito, they basically said that, look, workout to workout, beginners should be able to increase their performance. Week to week, intermediates should be able to improve their performance. And advanced is month to month. Now these, obviously it's not actually these 3 distinct continuums or 3 distinct categories, it is a continuum. And there is something along the whole way. And you know, if you are a very, very high level athlete, you may only be adding 1 pound of lean body mass to your stage weight in the next competitive year, or say 10 to 15 pounds to your total on your 3 lift powerlifting total over the course of 1 season to the next, which would be only maybe 2.5 to 5 kg per lift. So not very much, right? So, obviously it's a continuum. So, that's the way we do a beginner. Now let's talk about some progression schemes for intermediates. All right, so now we're going to go through just a sample progression scheme if you are an intermediate. Okay, so this is just some way of organizing your efforts to try to encourage progressive overload that matches to your rough training age. Okay? This is for someone who's been training probably more than 6 months, but less than 2 years intelligently. Okay? So, this is a great one for compound movements. This example is using the 6 to 8 rep range, and let's say 3 sets on an exercise. Week 1, that you have that programmed, you would choose a weight that you can complete for 3 sets of 8 without needing a spot, and with maybe only hitting failure on the last set or being a little bit short of failure. The next week, you come in and you would do 100 for 3 sets of 7. The next week, you would do 100 for 3 sets of 6. Then your 4th week would be an intentional light week in your periodization to help you recover before you do the next series of progressions. And then you would do only 2 sets and use the lightest weight and the lightest load combination. Sorry, this should read 110. So instead of, you've done 100 for 8s, 105s for 7s, 110 for 6s. Now you would do 100 for 2 sets of 6. So this is the smallest number of reps you've done in the last 3 weeks, the smallest number of weight in the last 3 weeks, and dropping off 1 set. Then you would start the progression over, but this time, when you do your 8s, you would start at the next increment and load heavier. So you do 105 for 888. So essentially, you're improving the load you can do for 3 by 6 to 8, or 3 by 8, every 5th week by 5 pounds. That adds up to a whole lot over the course of an entire year. Okay? Now this is an example of what's called linear periodization, meaning that intensity goes up as volume goes down. And now I know you're thinking, hold on, Eric, I thought my volume was supposed to go up over time. Well, of course it does. First week, we're doing 100 times 8 times 8, sorry, 24 times 100. 24 reps at 100. So 2,400 number of volume units of tonnage, right? By the end of the week, it's obviously going to be less. 18 times 110 is less. So our volume's going down. That's okay, because when we come back on week 5, now we're doing 24 reps again, but with 105. So the volume does this, and if you back up far enough, that becomes a straight line. So it's a wave loading linear periodization approach to just simply creating linear progress over time by getting you better at lifting heavy weights for a reasonable number of reps to accumulate volume, and starting it over after a light recovery phase and going heavier each time. Okay? Now let's talk about intermediates progressing on accessory movements or isolation movements that it's difficult to increase load on fast. All right. Now let's talk about if we were doing an isolation exercise. Now the reason why it's important is that your bench press might go, and I'll use myself as an example, from 155 to 330 over your career. That's more than a doubling in my strength in 11 years I've trained. Okay? So what that means is that, yeah, I can make those load increases on that 5th week basis like I was talking about in that last progression scheme, and it'll over time get me to where I want to go. Eventually it'll get more complicated, but let's assume I'm still an intermediate. However, if I was to try to add 5 pounds every 5 weeks to my bicep curl, that would produce an unrealistic amount of progress. That would mean I would get to make that 5-pound increase 10 times in 1 year. So I'd be adding 50 pounds to my bicep curl. The reality is most people can't even curl 50-pound dumbbells for 1 rep strict. So obviously we can't increase that fast. So another sample approach for an intermediate to improve isolation exercises, instead of increasing load, is to add reps. So this is almost a reverse linear approach, to where you're adding volume before you then increase the intensity, rather than decreasing volume while increasing intensity. Okay? So, double progression simply means that you don't progress the second variable until you progress the first variable. So the first variable in this case is repetitions. So this is an example of, say, bicep curls or lateral raises or whatever isolation movement you want, and the 3 by 12 to 15 is your target. And this could be done for 8 to 12 as well. Okay? So, you're choosing a load that you think you can get pretty close to 3 by 15, but not quite. So, you choose 20 pounds. The first week, you're able to get 14 reps on your first set, 13 reps on your second set, 12 reps on your second set. Now, don't try to find a pattern here. There isn't one. Basically, what you're doing is you're adding reps each week, trying to get to the goal of getting 3 by 15. However long it takes is however long it takes. But not until you get to 3 by 15 do you increase the load. So in this example, we've still got that 4th week light week. So we got up to 14, 14, 13 on our 3rd week. Then we deload, and we go to the bottom of the rep range and just do 2 sets. So 20 for 2 sets of 12. Easy. We get nice and recovered. We come back, and wow, we're almost there. We get 20 for 15, 15, and just barely don't get that last rep and get 14. Next week, we come in and pick up that spare, 3 sets of 15. And then on week 7, in this example, boom, we finally get to go to 25, and we get to start building back from the bottom of the rep range. So we get a smiley face. Makes sense, right? So that's an example of how you might have an intermediate who can still make pretty visible linear progress on more or less week-to-week basis, might want to progress. So let's talk about when you start to get more advanced. All right. Now we're dealing with an advanced athlete. This is someone who's attained 80 to 90% of the gains that they're going to get, but they're looking on what do I need to do to get that last 10 to 20%. All right? Now, for a compound movement that still has a decent amount of room to go up, we're going to use, this is just one way to do it, a 1 repetition maximum or an AMRAP, which stands for as many reps as possible. And from that AMRAP, you can derive an estimated percentage of 1RM using equations. If you just simply Google percentage 1RM estimation, you can enter the reps you've done at the load, if you went to failure, and it can estimate a 1RM. All right? So, if you're a power lifter or interested in 1 repetition maximum strength on specific lifts, you'd want to test your 1RM on those lifts on a semi-frequent basis. Semi-frequent. My advice would be somewhere between every 6 to 12 weeks, all right? Based on the time you think you can make a measurable jump up in load. Now, if you think about it, if you can squat 500 pounds, can you go up every single week? Probably not. You've probably worked years to squat 500 pounds. However, in a 12-week period, you may be able to go up to 505, all right? Now, what do you do with this information? If you're a power lifter and you've increased your training load by 5 pounds over 8 weeks, that's good, okay? If you think about it, there's 6 8-week periods in a year and then a few extra weeks left. That would be 30 pounds to a lift in a year. That's not bad at all for an advanced level athlete. That may even be overzealous, okay? So, you've increased your lift from 500 to 505. Now what do you do with that? Well, if you're training using percentages of 1 repetition maximum, like I talked about last week as a way of measuring an intensity, now all of a sudden your loads will go up. So on the day that you were supposed to do 80% of your 1RM, 80% of 505 is greater than 80% of 500. So your loads will make this small increase. And now you'll start to keep seeing that small increase in volume over time. Okay? So, your loads are steadily going up because you're testing your strength at an appropriate range of time. Now, does a bodybuilder need to do a 1 repetition maximum on their squat, bench, and deadlift? They may not even use squat, bench, and deadlift in their training. Perhaps they like RDL, front squat, and a dumbbell chest press. Well, another option is to do an AMRAP, and that's as many reps as possible. You can derive a 1RM from this, and then use a percentage-based program as a bodybuilder. My advice would be to do somewhere between a 3 to 6 repetition maximum. Any higher than that, and you're starting to get out of the range of being able to estimate a 1RM. And then training based on that percentages is not going to be as accurate. Okay? So you can do AMRAPs on your movements after you've maybe gone through some cycle of heavier loading, after a light loading, and then you can update your program based on this new estimated 1RM and continue to train, and again, that'll slowly tick your volume up. All right? Additionally, if you're a powerlifter and you're using certain accessory movements, like the example over there where we had front squats, RDLs, chins, rows, etc., maybe you don't want to do 1RMs on those. You can certainly do an AMRAP as well to program those. Okay? So that is a great way that I recommend for advanced lifters to track their progress and to continue to try to progress, is to track their percentage of 1RM. Now, what happens if you are to do this every 6 to 12 weeks AMRAP or 1RM and it doesn't change at all? Well, at that point, you need to go back to that flowchart idea I had of, okay, am I stalled? Yes, it's been 8 to 12 weeks and I've not improved my loads at all. Am I feeling recovered? No? Try a deload. Okay, now I'm going back to it. Am I still stalled? No? Great, carry on. If yes, probably need to cut back on my volume systemically to see if I'm just over-fatiguing myself and overreaching in a non-functional manner. However, if I'm stalled and I feel great, maybe it's time to increase the volume. So that might mean that you start adding more repetitions via sets or additional exercises, however you want to do it, to your workout. Okay? Probably if you're plateaued on a lift, you'd want to add more sets of that lift and be specific. Especially if you're a, say, power lifter and you're trying to get better at a squat, perhaps more squatting should be your first go-to. Accessory movements is not a bad idea at all. Perhaps you're stalled because you just need to get more muscularity, but it may also be a technique or just a neurological issue that's preventing you from getting stronger. So adding the volume in an intelligent place. We'll talk more about that in the exercise selection when we get there. Also, you have to think about when is it time to actually add more days of frequency. So if you're starting to push each one of those sessions up to that kind of upper tolerable level limit of volume, which may be right around 70 reps per body part, that's when you might want to add another day, drop the volume on that day, and spread it out so you can recover from it more effectively. Okay? So, it's that flowchart idea of, am I progressing, am I over-recovered, under-recovered, and then act from there if you're not making progress with this system of doing 1RMs or AMRAPs on a 6 to 12 week basis, depending on how quote-unquote advanced you are. All right, let's start talking about organizing training to help you progress more effectively. There are many different periodization models, and I've got a link to my review that I wrote with Alan Aragon, Peter Fitchen, Brad Schoenfeld, and John Cronin on the different models out there that seem to be pretty effective. However, I want you to remember that we're talking periodization. These are theories. You can make a terrible program based on the block periodization model, the daily undulating periodization model, reverse linear or linear periodization models. In fact, I could make a linear periodization model that was inferior to a daily undulating periodization model, or a reverse linear periodization model that would be inferior to a block periodization model, even though a lot of studies would suggest that one is better than the other. And that's because theories are just that, theories. How you actually build things off of them still need to have logic and thought and need to be catered to the individual and their goal. So let's talk about, given that, and they're also not mutually exclusive, which I'll talk about in a second, let's talk about a block periodization model. So block periodization just means that you have three basic blocks that have different goals. You start with what's called accumulation, where the goal is to build work capacity and to build up volume, to get structural adaptations, to get a lot of practice, and to basically get you doing a lot of work so that hopefully you can transmute that into something else. Then you intensify. You could call this the intensification block, probably the best way to understand it. Slightly shorter maybe, and in this phase you're trying to reduce the volume a little bit and increase the intensity, and therefore really push towards lifting heavier in the example of someone doing resistance training. And then you realize it by basically doing a taper, letting that fatigue dissipate, and then testing your strength to see was the overall goal successful. So here's a way you could approach it using these recommendations I've made. In your 6-week accumulation block, you're building from 40 to 70 reps per body part, training submaximal 3 times per week per body part. So that means you're pushing the limits of the volume. We're going to eventually get up to 70 reps per body part 3 times per week, but we're training submax. Okay? Meaning we're not taking sets to failure, we're leaving a little bit left in the tank. If we were to use the RPE-based system based on reps in reserve, you probably want to leave 1 to 2 reps in the tank at the end of each exercise in the last set. Okay? After that 6-week period and slowly building that volume up, 40, 50, 60, 70, or maybe 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70 over those 6 weeks, then we spend 4 weeks intensifying. Now, we're only going to do 40 to 50 reps per body part per session, but only train 2 days per week. Okay? Sorry, each body part 2 days per week. So we've gone to roughly 2/3 of the volume because now we've also increased the load. Now we're training closer to failure. We're pushing our loads up. By the end of it, we should probably be hitting some 9.5, 10 RPEs, meaning we're pretty damn near max on our last set, if not just a little bit left in the tank, probably not a full rep, but maybe some load. And that's the intensity phase for 4 weeks. Then we have a realization over 2 weeks. The first week is a taper. So this is us just trying to manage that fatigue that we've generated from the last 2 blocks. Now we're going down to 2 times per week, 40 reps per body part per each one of those weekly sessions, and we're training submaximally. Then finally, we spend another week after that doing AMRAPs or 1RMs depending on your goals and whether you're catering towards 1 rep max strength or just seeing if you're making progress, and doing just kind of your accessory work minimally. All right, just making sure that you're not just doing the compound movements with AMRAPs, you're also getting a little bit of accessory work for whatever your purposes and goals are. So that's an example of block periodization. Now, we're talking about training each muscle group 2 to 3 times per week. If you're using that upper-lower setup that I started with this video with, and let's say you have most of your high rep work on one day and most of your low rep work on the other day, that is actually daily undulating periodization, because daily undulating just means that you undulate between different goals on a day-to-day basis. So you could actually be doing a block periodized daily undulating program if you had, say, a strength, a power, and a hypertrophy day as your 3 days, or if you had a upper-lower strength hypertrophy program, whatever the way you set it up is. So they're not mutually exclusive. That's why it's even more difficult to talk about, hey, what's the best type of periodization? Because even within periodization models, you can have variation, and you can combine them. And sometimes you probably should. All right, so that's one example. I'm going to give you another example of some undulating periodization now. Okay, that last one was a bit hypertrophy-oriented. Now let's get a bit strength-oriented. This might be a powerlifting training cycle. And this is going to be based on what's called DUP, or daily undulating periodization. Again, you can have daily undulating periodization in a block. This is just a simple example of a pure daily undulating program. So a bit of background. The traditional daily undulating periodization model is based off of traditional linear periodization, whereby you do a hypertrophy first, strength second, and eventually power. This is based on general athletes, not strength athletes, who need a peak in power. But strength athletes need a peak in strength. So Dr. Mike Zerdos, who I talked about last episode, he did his dissertation on modifying the order so that you do hypertrophy first, which is a high volume of training, high delayed onset muscle soreness, high muscle damage, fatiguing session. And instead of trying to do your most important session in that fatigued state, you do the power session, which for a strength athlete would be more like heavy technique work, because we're not actually caring about how fast the bar moves. We care about, can we move a maximal load? So we do something, say 80-90% singles, doubles, maybe triples in the high 70%, that kind of range. So, but easily accomplishable even in a fatigued state. And then finishing up with the strength training when you are recovered. So here is an approach using the modified DUP for a powerlifter. Very basic, not necessarily optimal, but it's a very simple way you can implement it. All right, so we train one on, one off. So that means we're training Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, and next week we're training Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and then Monday. So it's roughly 3 to 4 times per week that you're training these, okay? We're going to bench every session, okay, because you're going to recover pretty quickly. And remember that every time you do a power session, it's a relatively low recovery. So you're, out of every 3 sessions, only doing 2 hard sessions, okay? And then we're going to alternate between the squat and the deadlift. So that means you're going to go bench and squat or bench and deadlift. Bench and squat, bench and deadlift, okay, in that fashion. And then each individual lift is going to be on its own rotating schedule between hypertrophy, power, and strength. So hypertrophy is not necessarily about the rep range, but about accumulating volume. And the easiest way to accumulate volume is in that 6 to 12 rep range. And at the end of your number of sets for your bench, your squat, or your deadlift, trying to achieve whatever volume level we have back from that 40 to 70 per session, we'd be nearing failure, okay? So that would be our hypertrophy session. This is an example. Our power session, we'd be doing singles, doubles, and triples. This is your heavy technique work, somewhere in the range of 75 to 85%, okay? Maybe up to 90% if it's a single. Now remember, this is a day where you're going to have a lot of trouble getting to that 40 to 70 reps per session. However, don't worry about it on bench because you've got a much higher frequency. And on your squat and deadlifts, remember that they overlap as far as muscle groups, but you could just put in a little bit of accessory work on this day, nothing too fatiguing, and get some of that volume. But also remembering that you're on slightly higher than a 3 times per week frequency. So you can be a little bit lower on the volume recommendations over there. Critical thinking versus rules, right? So, and then the strength session, that would be somewhere in the 1 to 6 repetition maximum range, doing multiple sets to achieve your target volume. And you can also, instead of that, do AMRAPs or 1RMs at that time point where it's appropriate for you to retest your strength. And you can also throw in deloads, where you use basically the low ends of these rep ranges and intensities and slightly less volume to recover. So for example, you could go through this, say, for 4 weeks, just trying to build in each individual session. Have a 5th week or 3 rotations where it's an easier week, and then finish, instead of doing a strength day, you do 1RMs on the big 3. Then if you see if you progressed or not, and then you update your program based on those new 1-rep maxes if you're using percentage 1RMs. Okay? So that's an example of daily undulating periodization, and you're still including that taper. On the note of tapers, let's talk about tapers. All right, so I've talked a lot about the taper, or the realization phase of a block periodization model, which is really just a taper. And this is just a tool to manage your fatigue that I talked about last session. This is also very similar to a deload. In the deload examples I gave you where we just dropped off a set, we roughly cut our volume to 2/3, and we had a very slight reduction in intensity, roughly 5 to 10%. If you think about using the load you could do for 8 reps and only doing 6 and dropping off a set. Small reduction in intensity, but it's there. And then going back to your normal training after that. This isn't just something I made up. This is based on some research into what is the most effective method for tapering to allow fatigue to go down to then express strength. And I want to point out that training versus expressing strength is our goal. Don't be the person who is constantly maxing out who are constantly testing strength are going to failure despite what your program says, because you just want to constantly know that you're progressing. That's probably an ineffective way to train unless you're specifically trying to do that and you have a plan to do it, like the Bulgarian weightlifting system or like squat every day by Matt Perryman. I wouldn't recommend that for anyone except an advanced lifter who has a specific goal of trying that out to see if it works for you. But in general, I don't want you to try to express your strength all the time. I want you to do it in a planned manner. And when you do it, you probably want to utilize some type of taper. Powerlifters always, not almost always, use a taper before they get on the platform. Same thing with weightlifters, same thing with pretty much any athlete who has a single-day competition, like a triathlete, an endurance athlete, a track and field athlete. So, how do we do it? Well, for strength athletes and force production, the taper can last roughly 1 to 2 weeks is probably the sweet spot. And we're looking for basically a 50 to 75% reduction of your normal volume. So that means maybe actually 2/3. I'm going to change this to 66. So essentially, you're doing half to 1/3 of your normal volume. So you reduced your volume a lot. This also goes hand in hand with specificity. If you've been training with 5s and 3s and 6s and 8s, and now you're only 2 weeks out from a meet, you're probably going to do a lot of singles. So it's going to be easy to not achieve a normal amount of volume. All right? And actually, I think I'm misquoting here. I'm going to change this to 33 to 66. So 1/3 to 2/3 of your normal volume. Right? And a 0 to 10% reduction. I might have to annotate that. I'm forgetting the exact figures. But roughly 1/3 to 2/3 of your normal volume, and 0 to a 10% reduction in intensity. So it means you can keep training heavy, but you'll probably have to drop more volume off, or you can make a slight reduction in intensity. We're talking that 5 to 10% range. This can be combined with 1 to 3 days off. So a great example would be you take a 2-week taper, and for those 2 weeks, you're mostly doing singles and you practice your openers. So this is, roughly pretty high intensity. Easy to get 1/3 to 2/3, maybe half your normal volume by doing mostly low reps, because you've been doing high reps previously in your build up to this competition. And then you slightly reduce your volume on that final week. You maybe have just a couple primer days. Let's say you normally train Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Now you just train Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So you take Thursday, Friday off, 2 days off. And on Monday and Tuesday, you just do singles at 80% and singles at 70%, and 2 days off and you compete. That would be taking 2 days of training completely off, a 0% reduction on week 1 and a 5 to 10% reduction on week 2, and then doing overall those 2 weeks probably about 1/3 to half of the normal volume you do. And boom, you've tapered. All right? So, we've talked about a lot today. This is an incredibly long video, way longer than I thought, because I initially addressed how to think about the frequency, intensity, and volume recommendations I made, and now we went to progression. We talked about how to make progression as a beginner, basically making increases workout to workout, how to do it as an intermediate, thinking about the week to multiple weeks progression, using some of those linear approaches I talked about, and then eventually when you get to advanced, thinking about periodization models, like the examples I gave of block and daily undulating, and also doing AMRAP and 1RM testing on a 6 to 12 week basis to then update your program if you're using percentage 1RM. All of that together, you also need to think about how do I manage fatigue, and this can be used using deloads, which are just a regular part of periodization, not something to be avoided, or tapers if you're specifically trying to compete in a competition. All right? So, that is it for progression. It's all downhill from here, I promise you. It gets a little easier. This was probably the thickest material, and I'll see you next time.